Today's video is sponsored by Ground News, of whom more in a bit. Hello everyone, I hope you're having a pleasant day, and if not, I'm sorry to hear about that. Today, I'd like to take a look at another of the might-have-beens of the tube network. Today, the idea to extend the Bakerloo line to Ealing Broadway, and the Central line to Richmond. The reason I'm making one video for both of these is because they were part of the same scheme. This is one I found in the Central London Rail Study, which was published in 1989 based on research carried out in 1988. To put things in context, the 2 decades prior to the study had been something of a boom time for London's railways. In 1968, the Victoria Line had opened, the first completely new tube line in over 60 years. In 1979 it was followed by the first part of the Jubilee Line, from Stanmore to Charing Cross. In 1986 the commuter railways of the city were revitalised by the Network South East programme. In 1987 light rail came to East London in the form of the Docklands Light Railway, and in 1988 the Thameslink Core began running, reopening across London main line railway that had been closed to passengers since the First World War. Meanwhile, London itself was seeing major growth. The industries that had once formed the lifeblood of the city were replaced with commerce. London was already an important financial centre, but the square mile was becoming more important than ever. While the Barrow boys were making their fortunes on the stock market, a new commercial centre was rising out of the rubble of the old docks in the east, and soon the Docklands would challenge the ancient city for supremacy. The change in the kinds of work people did in London also changed the patterns of commuting. Whereas before passengers were spread out during the morning rush, now they were increasingly concentrated within a single rush hour, from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. when the offices opened their doors. It was projected that while the number of people driving in would increase, even more would come in by rail. In short, London needed more trains. More trains means more time to read the news. What news? I don't know. How about all the news? That's why I'm partnered once again with Ground News. Ground News is a news aggregator that helps you see the full picture. Let me show you what I mean. Take this story about a recommended public sector pay rise. We see that more outlets that are considered right-wing are covering it than on the left. But we can also see in detail what's being said. Rocket News, which leans left, talks about the fact that the rise is above the level of inflation. Meanwhile, the Daily Express, which is on the right, focuses on dissatisfaction with the raise and directly attacks the government. The facts in both reports are the same, but you'd get a very different idea of the story depending where you look. You can also see who owns which outlets and how reliable they are, which is very handy at a time when news and propaganda are hard to distinguish. You can take things further with the blind spot feature, which shows which stories are being ignored by either the left or the right wing. If there's a particular subject you're interested in, you can also create a custom feed. For instance, I need to know what's going on in London, so I add that to my custom feed, and there you have it. If you follow my special little link, that is ground.news/jago, or just use that QR code down there, you can get 50% off the Vantage subscription. That's the one I use, which includes all the features I mentioned before, and much more. But maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to the 1989 study, shall we? There were several ideas proposed in this study. Some we actually got, albeit in a different form. The report advocates for concepts that would see the light of day as the Elizabeth Line, the Jubilee Line extension, and the Thameslink programme. Others were not so lucky, like the Chelsea-Hackney Line. I really should do a video on that one of these days. Then there was the southern extension of the Bakerloo line, which seems to have existed in a permanent state of limbo since the 1920s. And then there was what they called the Western Package. The thinking was this. The District line is quite complicated at its western end. It splits off into 3 branches. One to Ealing Broadway, one to Wimbledon, and one to Richmond. and also one to Kensington Olympia, but we're not going to count that for now. The problem is simple mathematics. The more branches you have, the fewer trains can go to each branch, because you can only run so many trains on the main trunk, as it were. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you can run 6 trains an hour on the main trunk. Well, that means that 2 trains an hour can go to each of the 3 branches, and no trains to Kensington Olympia, because it's a weekday. Richmond, Wimbledon and Ealing Broadway were all very busy places, so that just wouldn't be enough. I mean, in reality it was a lot more than that, but the point I'm making is that there weren't enough trains for the number of people who wanted to use each of those branch lines. Frankly, I think this illustrative example complicated matters rather than simplifying them, and that's why I could never be a teacher. That and the fact that the school I ran turned out to be a front for a chimney sweeping business. Now, the district used to be even more complicated, with trains to Uxbridge and Hounslow Barracks, but those were handed off to the Piccadilly line in the 1930s. And the Western package was proposed to do something similar, but more complicated. So the idea was this. A new section of the Central Line would be built from Shepherd's Bush to Turnham Green. It's not entirely clear from the report, but judging by the map, it looks like Turnham Green Tube Station would have undergone a bit of a rebuild to include the new line. Based on the map's key, the Central Line through Turnham Green would seem to be entirely new construction. From there, the Central Line would take over the Richmond branch of the District Line, running through Gunnersbury and Kew Gardens to Richmond. Oddly enough, this wasn't the first time it had been proposed to extend the Central Line to Richmond. In 1913, a proposal very similar to this one had been made, and another one in 1920 would have routed the line from Shepherd's Bush via Hammersmith over a disused mainline railway. Now, if you know the Central Line, you might have spotted a problem here. The Central Line, in our timeline, has a branch to Ealing Broadway and one to West Ruislip. If we go building a third branch to Richmond, then we have the same problem as we were trying to solve on the District Line. And that's where the other half of the package comes in. Everyone talks about extending the Bakerloo line to the southeast, but this plan would have extended it in the northwest. So what would have happened was that a branch would come off at Queen's Park. This would go to North Acton. There it would take over the Central Line branch through West Acton to Ealing Broadway. So, passengers from the District Line would be transferred onto the Central Line. Passengers from the Central Line would be transferred onto the Bakerloo line, which had surplus capacity since the Jubilee line had opened, and services to Watford Junction had been withdrawn. The scheme was projected to cost £150 million. Not cheap, but compared to some of the ideas put forward in the report, a bargain. Why didn't we get it? Other than the Bakerloo line being cursed, I mean. Well, the report notes that the Western package was conditional upon further studies. The flaw I immediately see in the plan is that the Central Line was very crowded at the time. This is even something the report acknowledges elsewhere. It was a high-priority problem that had been known about for decades. And yes, I know that high-priority problem and known about for decades seems like a contradiction in terms, but not if you know how long it takes to get a railway built in this country. But anyway, long story short, the Central Line was overloaded and messing around with the Western end wouldn't help. It might even make things worse. The Western package seems to have been considered to be a fairly low-priority plan in any case. The report doesn't even bother looking into the cost-benefit analysis of the scheme, which suggests that basically they didn't even think it was worth discussing. At least on its own. The report looks at a number of concepts that might have improved matters in tandem with the Western package. 3 east-to-west cross-London rail routes were under consideration. One was the Jubilee line extension. Another was what was known as East-West Crossrail, which would eventually see the light of day over 30 years later as the Elizabeth line. And the third was the Chelsea Hackney line, which would not only take some strain off the central London portion of the Central Line, but would also take over part of the Central Line in the east. Also at the time, new modern trains for the Central Line were under consideration. These were believed to be the simplest solution to the problems of overcrowding, and would be known as the 1992 stock. But in the long run, they didn't solve the problem because the Central Line just kept getting busier. Also, the 1992 stock had quite a lot of teething troubles, but that's another story. So in the end, the Western package was just another of those doomed concepts that didn't get much beyond a couple of lines on a map. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this well-packaged tale from the tube. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the Bakerloo line capacity to my overcrowded Central Line. Thanks also to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Click on the link in the description below to take advantage of their generous offer. And I will see you all again very soon. Cheerio.